Hello everyone and welcome to PeopleSoft channel. So this is the second part of the fifth interview preparation episode which we started in the last week. So part 1 of this episode is already available on the PeopleSoft channel. So in today's episode we will continue our discussion about PeopleCode interview questions. Alright, so without further delay, let's start the discussion. The next question is, what is component processor in PeopleSoft system? So as per PeopleBooks, the component processor is the PeopleTools runtime engine that controls the processing of an application from the time a user requests a particular component till the time the database has been updated and the processing of the component is complete. Now, what do we mean by that? Let me take an example. So let's say I enter into this component. Now, as soon as we enter into this component, we can see a search page has been created for us. So if we try to perform a search, let's say I perform a search with a blank value, then it is the component processor which takes our search input, it goes to the database, and from the database it takes all the matching values. Similarly, let's say we select a row of data and then we can see a component has been created with multiple pages inside and all the data required at level 0 has been populated. Similarly, the child records at level 1 has been populated with all the matching value. So you see all of these work behind the scene works. It is done by the component processor. Now it also manages the component buffer which contains the data required for your component, and it also takes care of all the PeopleCode events. So these are the PeopleCode events which are available. So if we have written PeopleCode at any of these events, it is the component processor which takes care of the execution of the PeopleCode when the particular event is live. For example, if let's say we change the value of this variable from 9 to 2, and if we save it, we can see the underlying PeopleCode is being executed. And finally, the changes will be saved to the database. And that's why it is the component processor, and it is called as the runtime engine because it is always in action as long as a user is active in a particular component. A follow-up question is, what is component buffer? So component buffer is a temporary area of memory on the application server which stores the data of the currently active component. For example, let's say we are trying to enter into this component for employee ID 1. Now this is the information for employee ID, and we know that as per the pure internet architecture, the data for employee 1 will be stored into this relational database system. Now what happens is, as soon as we enter into this component for employee ID 1, the component processor goes to this RDBMS system. It brings back the data of employee 1 from this database, and it puts that data onto a memory area on the application server. This is a temporary memory area, and that area is called as component buffer. So component buffer stores the data of the currently active component. We have currently active component as this one for employee ID 1. So component buffer will have the data for the employee ID 1. Now, if we go back to another component, or if we change the employee for the same component, this time component buffer will have the information about employee 21 instead of employee 1. Another follow-up question is, how do you access the data which is present inside the component buffer? So we just saw an example of component buffer, Now the question is, if you want to access the data, let's say for employee ID 1, which is present in that component buffer, how would you access that data? So in order to access the data present in the component buffer, we can use the built-in function called as fetch value, and if we provide the correct parameter of record field name inside the fetch value function, we can access the data for that particular value. Similarly, if we want to update the data present inside the component buffer, remember, we do not want to update into the database, but we just want to update the data in the component buffer. In that case, we can use the built-in function called as update value. This will update the value of a particular field which is present inside the component buffer. Another follow-up question is, what is row set, record, row, and field with respect to PeopleSoft component? So these four are the data buffer classes which are created when we access the PeopleSoft component, and it contains the data of a particular component. So these follow the hierarchical pattern. For example, a row set is at the top level. A row set can have one or more rows. Similarly, a row can have one or more record, or a row can also have child row sets as we go from higher level to lower level. And finally, we have a record which contains of one or more fields. So let us see one example to understand these four terms. For example, first we talk about row set, and we discuss that row set is basically collection of one or more rows. So to give you an example, we have this scroll area at level 1 and it is a collection of 3 rows. So the scroll area can be think of as a row set, and inside that row set we have these 3 rows of data. So this is about row set and row. So after row, we have the third data structure which is called as record. So each row can consist of one or more record, and a record resembles the table structure which is present into a database. For example, if we talk about this level 1 scroll area, then for a given row, we can have one primary record which is a physical table into database. At the same time, we can also have one or more work records which are not the physical tables. So that is nothing but the record inside a row. And finally, we have field. So field is present at the lowest level in this hierarchy, and a field means the individual fields which you can see on the page. Another follow-up question is, write PeopleCode to traverse and access the data for module field which is present at level 1. So if you see, this is the level 0 area of this page, and now we will start from the row set. Row set is nothing but a collection of rows. So in PeopleSoft system, we have only one row at level 0. So we will get that row using the get level 0 function. Now, as you can see, once we have the row, a row can have multiple records in it, or it can have multiple child row sets when we talk about parent-child relationship. So for this level 0, we have a child row set here, which is nothing but a collection of row. As we can see, we have 3 rows in this case. So we need to capture this row set. So we will capture this row set using the get row set function. And now once again, we are back to row set. The only difference is it a child row set. So from row set, again, it is a collection of one or more row. As you can see, this scroll area, this row set is collection of 3 rows. Okay. Now we have these 3 rows in our program. Now, as we discussed, a row can have multiple records. So if we talk about a scroll area, it can have one primary physical table or one primary record, At the same time, it can also have multiple work records. All right. So from that row, we will get a particular record that we want. So in this case, these four fields are coming from PCEMP project record. So we will get that record using the get record function. And if we have the record, finally we have the particular field. So from that record, we can finally access this module field. So that will be the hierarchy. Now let's see how we can access this field called module using PeopleCode. So this is the PeopleCode for our requirement. We will start with level 0 row set, and we will get the first row, the only row present at level 0 using the get level 0 function. Then we will get the particular level 0 row using the row set called get row function. Alright, so now we have the level 0 row. Then we will create a level 1 row set, which is the child row set, and we will use the get row set function to access the child row set. In this case, since we are using a scroll area, we need to mention the scroll keyword and then the record name and then the scroll name. Alright, so now once we have the level 1 row set, we know that we can have multiple rows of data in a row set. In our case, we had 3 rows of data. So we will simply use the for loop and then we will get each row. Alright. So after having each row, finally we have the particular 4 fields for each row, and then we can access our module field using the get record, because as we mentioned, we need to get the particular record, and from that record we can get the particular field using the get field function. So now we are taking that field for all the rows. We have 3 rows in our case, so we are taking the module field for all of these 3 rows and we are printing it. So let's see how this code works. So since we have written our PeopleCode at the component save edit event, let me make some changes and let me save it to trigger this PeopleCode. And as you can see, we have our first module here, which is the asset management. And now since we have 3 rows of data, it will print all the modules for all these 3 rows. So this is our module for row 1, this is our module for row 2, and finally this is our module for row 3. So in this way, we can write the row traversal PeopleCode to traverse from level 0 to all the way up to our target level, and then we can access the particular field. The next question is, how would you execute the data manipulation sequence such as insert, update, or delete these sequence using PeopleCode? So if we need to execute these kind of SQL statements directly from the PeopleCode, in that case, we can use the built-in functions in PeopleCode, which is called as SQL Exit. And in this function, we can pass the SQL statement that we need to execute. For example, I need to execute this SQL statement whenever the field change event of this field has been triggered. So what I have done is I have prepared my SQL statement like this, and I have included this SQL statement in the SQL exec function. So what I am doing is I am updating the basic salary to 1000 for employee ID 45 in the salary table. So if I query this table now for employee ID 45, I can see the basic salary is 0. Alright, so let me trigger the PeopleCode event for this variable field. So let me change it, and if I try to save it, I can see the saved message from database. So it looks like PeopleCode has been executed without any issue. So if I query the table, earlier basic salary was 0, but let me rerun the query, and now we can see the basic salary has been updated. Similarly, we can use the SQL exec function to execute insert statements and delete statement. The SQL execute function also accepts the bind variables. For example, here I have hard coded the values to 1000 and 45. But if I needed to provide these values as a variable, in that case, we can make use of the bind variable functionality. So that's about the basic of SQL exec function. A follow-up question is, what are the limitations when working with SQL exec function in PeopleCode? So the first limitation we have with SQL exec function is, if we are writing a select statement for a particular table, then the output will contain only one row of data, even though the table has multiple rows of data inside it. For example, I have written this select statement where I'm taking the employee name from the employee salary table. I'm storing the output in the employee name, and I want to display all the employees to the user using the message box function. So if I run this query in the SQL developer, then you can see we have 4 employees. So I'm expecting that when this code gets executed, I should get 4 rows of data or 4 employees in the message box. However, when the code gets executed on the PeopleSoft page, I got my first employee, which is Siva Koya, and that's it. I can no longer get the further employees. This is because when running the select SQL in SQL execute function, the SQL execute function will fetch only the first row which is present in this particular table. For example, if I check the database, Siva Koya was the first row of data and only that was executed. So it is not a good idea to use SQL execute function when we need to fetch multiple rows of data from the table. The second limitation when using SQL execute function is that we can write this function to execute database update statements only in these 4 PeopleCode events. So these are field change, save pre-change, workflow, and save post change. For example, right now, as you can see, I'm writing this code in the field with field change event, and this is the SQL execute statement. So if I make any changes and if I try to save it, I will get the message done, which is from this message box, and this confirms that there was no error. Alright, so this SQL execution was successful. However, if I move this code to, let's say, field edit PeopleCode event, which is not allowed to execute the SQL execute function, let's see what happens. So let me try to change the value now, and if I save it, I got the fatal PeopleCode SQL error, and then it says invalid SQL execute update for this kind of PeopleCode program. And it also suggests that SQL execute commands with update, insert, or delete statements are allowed only in save pre-change, save post-change, and workflow type of PeopleCode programs. So this is one area where we need to be cautious while using the SQL execute commands. And the third point is not a limitation as such, but a point that we need to be very careful about as a PeopleSoft developer when using the SQL execute function. So whenever a user makes any changes to the online page and he tries to save these changes, those changes are governed by the component processor, and only if all the details are valid and there are no errors, only then the database changes are saved and a commit is issued to the database. However, when we write such SQL execute statements, then it bypasses the component processor logic and it directly goes ahead and make this database changes as per the SQL. So this can be dangerous if we do not provide all the proper code validation and we are simply writing a SQL execute statements. So that is just one case where if we are using a SQL execute statement, please make sure that you are writing all the proper validation logic, and when all the conditions are valid and there is no exception, only then we should write such kind of SQL statements which directly updates the database. Another follow-up question is, how would you read multiple lines of data from the database using PeopleCode? For example, we have the employee salary table which has 4 rows of data, and we need to fetch these 4 rows into our people code. So in case we want to fetch multiple rows of data, we can make use of this create SQL statement, and we can write our select statement inside that. So in this example, I am taking a SQL object to which I am assigning this create SQL, and I have created an array which will hold multiple rows of data. So using the while loop, let me try to print the employee ID, which is the first field, and employee name, which will be the second field. The first element in the array will be the employee ID because that is the first field in this table, and the second element in the array will be the employee name. So let me add the second element in this people code. So this will be our people code. So let's test this people code. So let me make changes, and now if I try to save it, I have the first employee with employee ID and employee name, then the second employee, third employee, and fourth employee. Alright, so this is how you can fetch multiple rows of data from the database into your people code. So the next question is, how would you debug your people code if your code is not working as expected? So these are some of the useful ways to debug your people code program. So initially you can start with a simple win message function which will act as a placeholder in your people code. So whenever you have doubt whether your people code in a particular region or particular line is getting executed or not, you can place your win message people code with some custom message at that location, and if that win message gets printed, it will give you a confirmation that your code has reached that particular location. This can be very useful, especially when working with loops. If we want to simulate through each and every loop, we can definitely use win message function. The second method is to use a PeopleSoft debugger. PeopleCode debugger is one of the tool which is provided by the PeopleSoft system, and like how the debugger functionality or debugger tool works in other programming language, we have the same concepts available here, where you as a developer can simulate or navigate through your PeopleCode program. The debugger will store all the variable values, all the current values, all the component buffer values, etc. You can set breakpoints and you can do multiple stores in order to iterate line by line through your PeopleCode program. And this can be helpful to understand why particular lines of code is not getting executed, or why incorrect values are being calculated and assigned to the variables. And the third way in which you can debug any PeopleCode program or debug the application errors is using the trace functionality. So trace is nothing but it is a list of PeopleCode program or the SQL statements which is executing behind the scene whenever a user is working on the online page. So if you are in a situation where user is working something on the online page and the functionality is not getting executed as expected, you can set the trace, you can request the user to recreate that issue, and once you have the trace, you can go through the trace and you can analyze what is wrong and which is causing that error. So these are the three most commonly used ways to debug your PeopleCode or PeopleSoft application. So our last question for today, which is a follow-up question, is how can you set trace for your PeopleCode programs? So there are multiple ways to set trace for your PeopleCode program. The first one is setting the trace on the sign-on page. So this is the sign-on page for PeopleSoft system. So we can set the trace parameter here itself. So in the URL, if we append ampersand trace equals y, and if we hit enter, it opens these options to set your trace parameter, and then you can select the required trace parameters as per your requirement, and then you can log in. So this will enable the trace as per the parameters that you have set up. And once you log out from the system, the trace will be completed. The second way to trace the people code is by using the trace people code page and setting up the trace parameters. So in order to go to that trace people code page, we need to navigate to people tools, then utilities, then debug, and here we have three pages for trace. We have trace people code, trace SQL, and trace page. So since we need to trace people code, we will select this option. Here we can mention the tracing which is required. For example, if I need evaluator program, I would say this, and similarly I can check the required parameters. It will generate an integer value which will be nothing but the sum of all the individual values which we have checked so far. So we can save it, and then this will enable your trace. So if you want to stop the trace, you can again come here, you can uncheck this boxes, and that will stop your trace. The third way to set trace for people code is by using this built-in people code function called as set trace PC in your people code. For example, I need to trace this particular people code which is residing in the field edit event of this field. What I can do is I can use this built-in function called as set trace PC, and I have provided an integer value here. So whenever the system executes this particular program in the field edit event, from here the system will start tracing, and here the system will end tracing. Now the question is, how can we get the correct integer number to be passed here? We can obtain that correct integer number from this trace people code page. For example, if we want to perform trace for these three kind of categories, we can check this, and now we are getting a trace value of 28. That will be your integer number which you need to pass. So if I use the set trace PC function with a valid integer here, the system will start tracing whenever it reaches this people code program. And finally, I am passing an integer number 0 to indicate the system to end the tracing. So let's see how this functionality works. So this is the employee page, and let me change the variable value to initiate that field edit people code event. So if I save it, it is printing all the 4 rows of data as we seen earlier, and finally it has been saved. So if I check my PeopleCode logs directory, I can see this trace file which is generated. So let me check this trace file, and if I open it in my notepad, you can see the trace that has been generated as part of the set trace PC function that we set up. And the fourth way using which we can set up the trace is by using the trace utility from the configuration manager. So in the application designer, we can access the configuration manager using this go option and say configuration. So here we have this option for setting trace, and here based upon your requirement, you can set up the trace for the SQL, PeopleCode, or application engine program. You can configure your trace output file, and this will start generating the trace for your applications. Alright guys, that's it for today's episode. If you found this content helpful, then please like this video, and if you are interested in to search PeopleSoft content, then please subscribe to the channel. Thank you.